Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being here in this session. Just want to highlight that my colleague, Mara Naughton, is also part of the session and help put this together. And the two of us are going to take you sort of on a journey with regard to threat intelligence, and specifically kind of start from a 30,000-foot view and then drill into some of the specific applications of intelligence and talk through that. So really appreciate your engagement as we go through this presentation. Just for background, I've been at Recorded Future about 6 years now, and I lead the threat intelligence program as well as our customer success program. And it's been just an incredible journey and really an adventure over the last 6 years, because I've really been able to interact with not just operational folks that put hands on keyboard, but really a lot of CISOs and deputy CISOs to really think through some of the business cases and some of the strategic challenges that CISOs face on a daily basis. So a lot of this content is really responding to a lot of those conversations, and I'll be super interested to get your input as we go through it today. So let's start at a very high level, again, 30,000-foot view when it comes to threat intelligence, specifically what, answering the question, what does success look like for a threat intelligence program? And there's two aspects of this, again, at a very high level, right? In order to be able to quantify risk, in order to be able to communicate risk, you have to have two sides of the equation. You obviously have to know, what your security controls are at any given point in time, but you also need to understand adversary tools and tactics and so forth. If you understand both sides of the equation, then of course you're able to understand what your risk is. And as we know, there's a very small slice of a threat landscape that actually represents risk to a particular organization at any given time. And in a world of aggressive uncertainty, which is really kind of where we find ourselves coming out of COVID, risk management is more critical than ever before. So this is sort of laying the groundwork in the 30,000-foot view here. We have a poll question at this point. What are your current security priorities?
Okay, folks, same drill as always. The more you participate, the more information you'll be able to gather for the session. So as mentioned, what are your current security priorities? Automation, investing, hiring more tools, resources for better threat prevention, maximizing investment in current security solutions, or other. Give this another 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
We have an all of the above. We
missed all of the above. Fair enough. Thank you for that, George. Appreciate it. All right, let's end that and share those results.
Yeah, so it looks like a pretty even split between automation and maximizing investment in current security solutions. And that's a pretty common refrain, I think, where a lot of organizations are obviously spending on security controls and new solutions, but it does take time and take effort to implement those. And obviously, the more automation that you can implement, the better off you are, which also affects hiring, because of course, hiring and retaining great people is continuing to be a challenge. So automation really has become even more important. And that's especially doubly true, I think, in threat intelligence. So we come to the third point here, which is what is actionable? And I hear this a lot in the industry. People say all the time, intelligence needs to be actionable. And I think what they mean when they say that the word can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. But I think what we're talking about when we talk about actionable is, can we measure and can we communicate risk reduction? Can we measure and communicate the improvements that are ultimately going to lead to risk reduction? And if that is our agreed upon sort of definition of actionable, what we're going to do is really go through different verticals of intelligence and think through what are the actionable outcomes and whether you agree with those outcomes. So the first question I have in this matrix, the important rows are obviously intelligence, consumption, and outcomes. So producing threat intelligence is great, but the most important piece is how does the business want to consume that intelligence to drive outcomes? And then how do you measure and communicate those outcomes, right? That's so important because, again, everyone says, well, it needs to be actionable, but what does that actually mean? I'm going to be a little bit provocative here and say that if actionable means that you want some people to create reports and you want those people to send those reports throughout the organization to increase awareness, you can do that with a couple blogs, a couple RSS feeds, a couple podcasts, and email newsletters. But how does increasing awareness, how does that actually become something that you can measure and communicate in terms of risk reduction? I would submit to you that it's very hard to link those two things together. So, there are a lot of threat intelligence programs that are very focused on, creating a daily threat report, creating a weekly threat report. And there's nothing wrong, of course, with creating reports, but if the reports don't lead to something that can be measured and communicated, they may be missing the mark. And I think that's what a lot of people mean when they say actionable. So we have a poll question here. Do you currently automate your intelligence? And by that, there's a couple of different categories here, and we're really talking about the consumption layer here. You can see the different options for consumption, but what does that overall level of automation look like for you in your current state?
Okay, folks, another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this poll. Last second edition there. There you go.
Wow, that's incredible. We actually have 13% of you, 3 of you said completely automated workflow, which is really impressive. I think it's very challenging to do that. As everybody knows, it's easy to sort of talk about, and there's a lot of shiny products out there. But when it comes to actually doing the integrations and creating automated workflows, it's very difficult. It's very challenging. So kudos to the 3 that are in a completely automated workflow. Obviously, 19 of you, 80% are in the some automation phase, which is where, in our experience, pretty much everyone is in, at some point of the automation journey. And then a couple of you are still in the manual. So when you think about and thank you for the responses, it's super informative on these poll questions. So when you think about the consumption layer, there's a lot of different ways you can consume in an automated fashion, everything from email reporting, automated actions on email, API integrations with things like ticketing systems or other systems of record. It could even be a browser extension. There's a lot of different ways to automate. And obviously a big topic today is how you go about doing that and how you create the playbooks. And there's a lot of products that have sprung up around that. But it's really important to think through, what is that ideal consumption layer? So beyond the consumption layer, we're really just going to go through each of these verticals because, again, I think a lot of times there's preconceived notions about what threat intelligence is and what it isn't. And a lot of times when I talk to CISOs, especially, I hear, threat intelligence is a feed, and everybody knows that phrase of speeds and feeds, where there's bad indicators, there's good indicators, and that's certainly one type of threat intelligence, but there's so many different types of intelligence that we're really going to sort of lift the hood and dig in here on the different types of intelligence and really what the measurable outcomes are and how we want to measure and communicate those. So for our first vertical here, which I call brand and identity intelligence, the intelligence is really being very granular here. What are those typo squat domains? What are those lexically similar domains to my organization? What are the stolen credentials? And even, what are the code leaks that are out there? I remember a couple of years ago, I ran into a Fortune 500 client who came back and said that they had a developer who was backing up their entire hard drive to a public GitHub repo every night, going home, resyncing to the repo, doing a little bit of work, resynchronizing and going back to work in the morning. Wasn't even paying for a private repository. It was just, 200 gigs or whatever the hard drive size was syncing every night to this public GitHub repo. It was kind of interesting and scary for the in-house counsel. But that's really what the intelligence is in this bucket, right? And I put some cautionary examples up here, British Airways being one of them in 2018. Obviously, British Airways had a pretty significant event with MageCart where payment card data was being exfiltrated out to a command and control server. It was one of the MageCart groups behind it, but the command and control server was a typo squat of the British Airways domain that they were not aware of. So when it comes to the outcomes, right, again, measurable, can communicate them. I would submit that you're looking at counting the number of account resets, right? So how many accounts are actually valid accounts within your organization, and then how many of the domains are actually, being used in either a phishing attack or other type of attack for data exfiltration, and how many of those can you take down? So that's sort of the hard, crunchy metric. And when we look at the actual, very granular sort of intelligence, it's not hard. You've all seen this before, right? There's a lot of credential dumps that are out there, and a very small percentage belong to the organization. In this case, I'm just using BA as an example, and an even smaller percentage that are actually legitimate credentials. But there is the potential to automate here, right? Because you can, of course, integrate into an Active Directory infrastructure to automate the process of determining, is this a valid credential? And if it is a valid credential, let's automate the password reset for it. And then on the bottom there, of course, is just an example of what a lexically similar domain could look like. And I'm just using Coke here as a generic example. Not just, yes, there is a domain, or there's a TypoSquad domain, but there's actually a TypoSquad domain that was registered a month ago. That same TypoSquad domain had an SSL certificate registered 2 weeks ago. And there's a whole lot of articulation, for why something needs corrective action, though. So the poll question here is, are these the correct measurable outcomes, the correct actionable outcomes specifically for brand and identity?
Bear with me, folks. Are these correct for brand intelligence? I have here. Is that correct? There you go. Or is that the incorrect one? I do apologize. Okay, folks, nice voting going on here. We'll let it go for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Interesting, Levi.
Yeah, fascinating. So half of you said yes, half of you said no, roughly 20% yes, 20% no is split. And then 60% of you are unsure, which is super interesting. I think this is, again, one of those intelligence verticals that folks don't necessarily think about, in terms of, what is the threat intelligence and what are the outcomes we want to achieve with it. So that's super interesting. Super interesting to follow that, and maybe think about what are the correct outcomes for brand and identity intelligence in terms of, what is actionable and what can you measure, what can you communicate in that particular silo or that particular vertical. So the second one we have here is vulnerability management, and the intelligence really is about what are those vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited in the wild on the internet, and potentially, pre-MBD or even pre-CVSS score vulnerabilities, where there is a legitimate articulation of exploitation happening in the wild. That's really, I think, personally, what the crux of the intelligence in that vertical is. And the outcomes is really, being able to articulate patch prioritization, improve patch prioritization. And as you all know, considerable resources sometimes need to be spent in a very short amount of time to remediate a particular vulnerability. But being able to articulate that to a business unit becomes really critical. So, there are many of these types of vulnerabilities that lack CVSS scores or pre-MBD, and you will see proof of concept exploit code, pop up somewhere on the web or in other types of criminal forms, before that data comes through. So, there's obviously a lot of options in the vulnerability category for integrating threat intelligence specifically into vulnerability scanners. Doing the asset inventory internally and understanding where vulnerabilities exist and combining that with threat intelligence data. That's a very common automation scenario. But on the outcomes, are these, again, the correct measurable outcomes for vulnerability intelligence? Is it being able to better articulate prioritization? Is that the hard, crunchy metric that needs to be communicated in this intelligence vertical?
You go for the poll here, Levi?
Yeah, sorry, Jason.
Yep,
Sorry.
you're good. All right, no worries, folks. Another poll, obviously, for you to go for here. Are these the correct measurable outcomes for vulnerability intelligence on this occasion? Vulnerability intelligence. Okay, as the votes come in, let's go for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
40% say yes,
Mhm.
8% say no, and then again, over 50% are unsure. So I think that's really the point of this conversation, right? Is to hopefully be a little bit provocative and thought provoking, and helping you think through, how you measure and communicate outcomes, right? Outcomes that are going to reduce risk, and how intelligence can, potentially help you get there. Very, very interesting. So for our third vertical here, we have third-party vendors and suppliers. And as you all know, this is a topic that is very timely and very relevant. Take your pick, whether it's colonial, or you want to go back further to the end of last year with other types of software that were making the headlines. This is a very important and very timely topic, and there's obviously a lot of vendors and out there that are doing the outside in view, right? Which is, what does your infrastructure as an organization look like, and where are the vulnerabilities, where are the exposures, right? And that's really the primary intelligence. And again, that's the type of intelligence that can be combined with your internal asset vulnerability scanning or inventories. The outcome, I would say, is improving your ability to have conversations with your tier one third-party vendors, third-party suppliers. And maybe you're not actually going to enforce contract terms or terminate a vendor or supplier, but I think being able to count the number of instances where you are able to initiate that conversation is really helpful and really important, because oftentimes the vendor supplier may not be aware of a particular security situation. And if you're able to help them remediate it, obviously that is going to reduce risk for your organization by extension. So as I said, there's multiple vendors in the space that obviously do this outside in exposure analysis and analytics. And there's a lot of different sort of analytics that you can look at. Obviously, is a particular host communicating with a C2 command and control server? Is there an uptick in exposed credentials in the quote unquote dark web? I don't like that term, but I'll use it here. Are there problems in terms of the email or domain records? There's all types of different ways to kind of look at and slice the data. But again, ultimately, the outcome should be, we can measure the number of conversations that we're able to have with our vendor suppliers and or take further action because of those analytical insights that the intelligence is creating and providing. So over to Jason, is that the correct outcome for third-party risk? Okay, we have a yes in the early running here. Excellent. So almost 75% said yes. So that was a pretty defined outcome that everyone agrees on. Very different from the other ones, which is great. And I can see in the comments here that there's a lot of challenges with third-party risk, and not just being able to understand, what a particular vendor's exposure is at any given time, but also, what sort of access that vendor has inside the organization, which of course is always true and very, very relevant. All right, well, moving on to security operations. The vertical here is really, from my perspective, the intelligence is about indicator of attack and indicator of compromise enrichment, and correlation. And I think, this is the intelligence vertical that I think most people, that come from a security background are probably most familiar with this one. Again, to the point about speeds and feeds, uh, but there's an ability to obviously do correlation in a SIM-like environment to take all the log data that is available in your internal environment and compare those logs with known bad indicators of compromise, and then even further potentially detect or block action, whether that be with an IDS, whether that be with a firewall. But of course, the indicators are very granular and the artifacts very granular and flexible. So there's a lot of things you can do in an automated workflow, right? Whether it's integrating with Splunk or QRadar, whatever your SIM of record is, and even combining that with a SOAR type technology. So that's the intelligence, but what are the outcomes? I would submit that the outcomes are that you're able to improve the number of verdicts that you're actually able to make in a given time period. So if you have a security operations center, you have someone working an 8-hour shift, they should be able to triage more tickets if you have this type of intelligence available, and especially if it's being automated and that correlation, you're going to get quicker event verdicts, which means ultimately you'll have more verdicts in terms of volume over time, which again reduces risk. And then where you have an incident or you have a security incident or event, being able to triage that faster because the indicators that are involved in it, you can reach conclusions and gain enrichment and context on those much quicker, becomes again really helpful toward reducing risk. And those are things that you can obviously measure, right? You can measure and communicate those. So in this example, I just put up an IP class C range here. And then there's one particular IP address that we have been watching, and it's actually related to APT 27, which is a Chinese nation state group. And they have been exfiltrating data from a number of organizations, some of which are in the United States. And that 142.93 is actually a command and control server that they have been using for a lot of that data exfiltration. So of course, in a practical sense, right, you want to know that IP is, quote unquote, a bad IP. You put some periodicity around it, right? Is it bad today? Is it bad tomorrow? Was it bad yesterday? And being able to, provide that context in terms of the correlation becomes really, really helpful in terms of the automated processes and playbooks and workflows that you have going on internally. And again, this tends to be, a core sort of focus of intelligence when people sort of initially think about it. So is this outcome of quicker event verdicts and faster event triaging, is this, to Jason, the correct outcomes for this type of intelligence?
Poll is up, folks. Are these the correct measurable intelligence outcomes for SecOps? Yes, no, or unsure. Let us go for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Last second edition. There we go. Perfect.
Interesting. So 46%, almost 50% said yes, but almost 50% said unsure. And I guess I would love to know from those that are unsure if they have alternative metrics or they have alternative outcomes that they think are better representative of the particular values or outcomes that they want to see out of that particular intelligence type. Yeah, so Mario is just saying that indicators of compromise can oftentimes overwhelm the analyst. And I think that's a common refrain. We find that's very common, and comes back to the point about automation. And he's saying sometimes even the SIM can't handle it, which is a great point, because obviously there are huge issues of scale here that we're not talking about. And it's easy to just say, well, automate all the things. But of course, planning to handle the scale is really, really challenging because of how many quote unquote bad indicators there are at any given time. The sheer scale of that and the sheer scale of internal telemetry and log data that gets produced by the organization is really mind-boggling sometimes, depending on the size of the enterprise and the organization. It's a great point. All right, on to our next vertical here. So this is the geopolitical intelligence vertical, and I put this in here primarily because it's a little bit different. It's not, I wouldn't call this cyber threat intelligence. This is a different type of threat intelligence, but it can be relevant to the private sector. Obviously, it tends to be more relevant in the public sector, whether it's the intelligence agencies, law enforcement, military, and so forth. But I personally think there's value in the intelligence from a business continuity perspective. Whether you're doing monitoring for executive threats, you're monitoring executives while they travel, or you're even looking at certain types of geopolitical events like protests that could impact your ability to access certain buildings or locations, or even where your data centers are stored and where your data is. So I think in the private sector, that's really where geopolitical intelligence comes into play. And again, very different from cyber threat intelligence. And I think the outcomes can be, being able to measure the number of times that you're able to inform the organization. And I never use those terms, but informing the organization about an event that's developing or about to develop, right, that impacts some piece of business continuity can be really helpful in terms of the outcome for that type of intelligence. So here I just put in a map of Seattle, and that is showing some of the social media events that are occurring in and around the Seattle area, right now, and being able to, process those and being able to make determinations again about protests or other, natural disasters that may be happening in a particular area. So Jason, let's put up the poll and let's see what people think about the outcomes here around geopolitical intelligence versus cyber intelligence.
There you go, folks. Poll is up. Are these the correct measurable outcomes for geopolitical intelligence? And again, we'll let this go for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Oh, wow. Movement right at the last second there. Okay, here you go.
So no beat out yes just by a hair. I'm sorry, unsure.
Right.
Unsure beat out yes just by a hair. So almost evenly split between yes and unsure. And a couple of you said no. So this is another one, I think, just, again, hopefully it's thought-provoking to think about, what are the outcomes and how would we measure them and how would we communicate them if, we had geopolitical intelligence, and how would we automate it, right, is another question to some of the earlier comments, because I think, the worst thing in the world is to have a bunch of analysts sitting around staring at monitors all day, hoping for something to happen, or, looking for a particular type of event. Obviously, being able to automate becomes so important in this workflow as well. So now we move to the actual threat vertical, and this is a vertical that we could probably name threat TTPs, or tools, tactics, and techniques. This is sort of the core intelligence here is what I would say is really the TTPs, or new adversary TTPs, evolving adversary TTPs, or even trend identification. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That is a helpful framework for understanding TTPs and how those are changing and evolving. But none of that does you any good if you're not able to convert into the outcome section here, which is really understanding where you have security control gaps. And that is, to be honest with you, that's not a trivial thing, right? That is a fairly complex workflow. It's a fairly mature workflow for a red team or a threat hunting team to be able to determine whether a particular TTP or set of TTPs is going to be effective in your organization against the security controls that are already present there. So if you start from the sort of assumption that, well, we have vendors, we have AV vendors, we have EDR vendors, we have network security control vendors. We've invested in, web proxies, we've invested in all kinds of different technologies that, help us with a layered approach, defense in depth and so forth. But I would submit to you that it's a bit of a faulty assumption to assume that because you have those vendors in place and you've checked the box, that new tools and new techniques are not going to work in your environment. And the reason for that is that a lot of these vendors are, rightfully so, processing quite a bit of malware every day, and they develop signatures and heuristics, based on the processing of 10 million samples a day. And there's a lot of noise to weed through. Meanwhile, there's a lot of actors that are open sourcing their tool sets in places like GitHub. And what I've put here is actually showing you some changes that Insight Group, the research team at Recorded Future, has tracked over the last 30 days, looking at 30-day changes in popularity on code repos in GitHub. And these are all tools that have been open sourced, and they are likely to be used in future attacks. And we've seen the cycle over and over again where somebody open sources a quote unquote tool, and 3 months later it gets used in a fairly significant breach. And why does that happen? Why is Cobalt Strike, which is freely available as a commercial tool to go obtain, why is Cobalt Strike still so successful? Why is it mentioned in so many of these attacks, including the attack on Colonial? Right? It's because there's a faulty assumption that we all make at different levels at different times, that we have a vendor and we have a control that is going to obviate the risk of a particular type of TTP, when that's not actually the case, right? So intelligence that's able to surface new TTPs or evolving TTPs is great, but if you're not able to take those and actually do the due diligence to understand, do our email security gateways actually function the way that we think they do? Is the efficacy of the detection or the prevention, is it at the level that we expect against a Cobalt Strike or against a Scarecrow or against any one of the tools that gets open sourced every week? Is really, it's a tough question to answer. It's not trivial, but you're sort of taking your program to the next level in terms of being able to identify where you do have security control gaps that you didn't realize. And sometimes those gaps are only 42 or 48 hours or 72 hours before your vendor will catch up in terms of the signatures. But I think this dynamic is one that persists, unfortunately, because it does require time and resources, and not everyone has those. There are automated solutions out there. So a friend of mine started a company called Attack IQ, and they basically score your controls based on scenarios that you can build, and you can do that in an automated fashion. So it doesn't have to be that you have to go build a threat hunting team or you have to have a red team. There are definitely good automated solutions in the market that can help in this space as well. So back to the poll, Jason, is this the correct outcome? Is security controls, gap identification, is that the correct outcome for TTPs in this particular intelligence type?
Okay, lovely participation still, folks. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. Let's get this going for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okey-doke.
Nice. 67% said yes. That's excellent. It's the first time I have agreement, so I'm gonna take it. That's huge. That's fantastic. 67% of you agree that this is the right outcome to measure and communicate. So that's great. Super encouraging. And I think this is really where a lot of the intelligence industry is going in terms of, it's obviously a multi-tiered solution, and the indicator piece and the brand identity piece and vulnerability and all the things we talk about are great. But if you can start to move in this direction, the gains in terms of understanding risk can be really, really significant. All right. So that really brings us to our last intelligence vertical, which is financial fraud. And most of you are probably familiar with different types of financial fraud, and it has varying levels of nexus and varying degrees of relevance to you and your organization, depending on the industry vertical that you operate in. But the intelligence that I think generally represents this category best are stolen payment cards, as well as proxy and VPN nodes. So even if you're not in financial services, but you run an e-commerce platform, or you're involved as some sort of vendor, or you run a network for payments, being able to determine who the customer is when they hit your website is really advantageous. And the outcomes is obviously reducing financial losses in a very direct sort of way. It's not difficult to measure that year over year. And then also you're able to improve brand equity, which admittedly is I'll admit that's not really one that's easy to measure and communicate. So I fibbed a little on that one, but I needed a second bullet point there, so I threw it in. And if we talk about measurable fraud outcomes, and what the intelligence look like, everything from stolen payment cards that get used in card not present transactions to, on the left side there, I threw some of the recent proxies that were pasted in a Telegram channel yesterday. And obviously all you need is an IP address and a port to be able to bounce through a particular host or node on the internet. And that, VPNs are cheap and there's a lot of them. Same thing with the SOX proxies is what you're looking at there. And then of course also cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency addresses in terms of following the money for know your customer can also be a very relevant intelligence that can lead to reduced financial fraud, right? And saving the company and organization more money. So just last question on the outcome there for financial fraud, are those the right outcomes, or are there other outcomes that are better suited for measurement?
Final one here on fraud intelligence, folks. As you said, are these the correct measurable outcomes for fraud intelligence? Let's run for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Oh, excellent. 50% said yes. So again, another win. I'm going to take it. Actually, the wins on these polls are the unsure. I think the unsures are the best because it means there's still a lot of thought and debate to be had, which is really the best. But in this one, 50% said yes, and then 25% said no, and 25% said unsure. But again, on the unsures and the no's, would love to hear more about how to measure the outcomes around intelligence and financial fraud. Would be great. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and attention, and really the engagement. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate it. And we have one final poll question, which is really a summarization. Is it worth investing in an intelligence program if it's not baked into vendor products? So a lot of what I hear from CISOs is we expect intelligence to be baked into the security products that we buy, and I 100% agree with that. But of course, we're not there yet. It's a very nascent sort of industry and nascent sort of movement with product. So if it's not baked into your products, whether it be your IDS or your firewall, whatever appliance or vendor we're talking about, is it still worth investing in that intelligence program?
As a result,
excellent. 86% said yes. Excellent. And a couple said unsure. Well, really, again, appreciate so much your time and attention and engagement in this. This has been great. And hopefully it's been helpful for you in thinking through some of the, not just applications of intelligence and the outcomes, but also what the intelligence itself could be or should be in different verticals.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Levi. Well, we've got some questions, obviously, for you. We've still got some time left here, so let's dive in. I'll leave this slide up, folks, just so obviously if anyone wants to take notes of Levi's email there and they wanted to reach out with any additional questions they may have. First question that comes in, what automation capabilities would you recommend using your product to automatically correlate and visualize threat actor tactics, techniques, and procedures using the MITRE ATT&CK framework?
That's a good question. So we have a number of customers that put in a lot of work in doing attack mapping, and they do it by different actor groups. And what I've seen, with a lot of our clients is unfortunately, there's a lot of manual analysis happening in Excel spreadsheets, and they have a tab, for APT 1 through APT 50, and they're really sort of exploding out the attack paradigm in each one of those tabs. I haven't seen, to be honest with you, I haven't seen a fully baked automated solution that can help here. But again, I will say, not plugging Attack IQ too much, but they do have an API and you are able to build scenarios based on MITRE attack codes and categories to score your controls. But that's really the only vendor that, and I have no financial ties to them whatsoever, just for clarity. But beyond them and their API, you know, I haven't really seen a great automated solution yet.
Thank you very much. How do results from threat intelligence translate to the board?
Yeah, so if you go back to the original slide that we were looking at, that 30,000-foot view, again, you can't really articulate risk to the board if you don't have the intelligence side of the equation. So you can certainly talk about the security controls that you've put in place, but you can't really talk about risk in the same way at the same level. And I think quantifying risk becomes so important. I actually wrote a book on this topic last year. It's a quick read if you're interested. You can literally read it in 2 or 3 hours. It's on Amazon, and it really dives into some of the techniques and the tactics that I think are going to be helpful for quantifying risk. Because today, so much of the conversation with the board is really around things like traffic light signals and high, medium, low, and it's really hard for the board to understand what that means. You know, are they supposed to lose more sleep or less sleep when the traffic matrix says yellow or medium? You know, it's really hard for them. So I think being able to quantify risk in the language of loss just becomes so important for the board, because they may not understand the language of security or technology, but they understand the language of risk and loss. So being able to talk through how you come up with an annualized loss exposure number and how implementing new security controls are going to affect that number, you know, what the model looks like and what the inputs and what the assumptions in the modeling become really important. So I think, again, that's where the industry is heading. Telling a better story to the board means you know, having a better handle and grip on what risk actually is. And again, you can't do that without threat intelligence.
Thank you very much. Another question that's come in. How would you advise I integrate intelligence into current security programs? How would you advise I integrate intelligence into current security programs?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is start with manageable goals and objectives. You know, we just looked at a matrix slide that, to be honest, is pretty daunting. You know, when you think about all the possible intelligence categories, the workflows, the consumption layer, and then the outcomes, that's an enormous amount of work. I think the best thing to do is to start small and think through, you know, one of those verticals, one of those applications of intelligence. Maybe you start with brand and identity, or maybe you start with security operations, or you start with vulnerability management, right? But just taking one of those and really focusing on, you know, how you build the workflow, how you measure the outcomes, is a great place to start, right? And that's the operational side. I think organizationally, you can have your own org, or you can put them in the IR group. There's a lot of different ways that you can sort of slice it organizationally. But if you start small with just one of the applications and verticals, you know, you can show progress and show success. Again, measurable outcomes is so important that you design those up front. And then over time, you can start to expand your program, right? You can add another vertical, maybe, you know, a year later and so forth. So I think that's really kind of the maturity journey, right? And as you gain more resources, hopefully, because you're able to prove the value of the intelligence and how it's being consumed and the outcomes it's driving, you can ultimately obtain more resources and continue to grow it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And the final question we have here is a pretty straightforward one. Do you have customers in Canada?
Do we? Yeah, we have all kinds of customers in Canada. I've been to Canada a couple times. I love Canada. I've been all over, so Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal, and it's a great country, and we have a bunch of clients up there. So if anyone's interested, I'm always ready for another trip to Canada if I can piggyback on it.
Mario's just mentioned in the chat feature there that he is one of them, so that's fantastic. So follow-up question to that is, I assume you monitor our geo side as well, Canada's geo side as well.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
So the first part was, do you have customers in Canada? The second one, I assume you monitor our geo side as well.
Canada's geo side?
Yes.
Yeah, so in our platform and our product, you can set up locations really anywhere in the world, and there's a whole intelligence vertical specifically for geopolitical, and that can be fine tuned, obviously for your region and the locations that are important to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Levi. Well, again, I'm going to ask our audience to join me in a virtual round of applause for Levi. Fantastic content and a lot of intelligence there. There's some comments coming in, really detailed, greatly well presented, well done, great content. Yes, I agree. And lots of chat going on throughout as well, and some sharing of opinions. And thank you again, Maura in the audience, for supporting that also from Record of Future side. Wait a sec, there was, no, thank you, that's everything. There's no more questions. Okay, great. So that does bring a close to day 2, folks. So at this point, I want to thank our speakers again for today. Obviously want to thank Boomi and Record of Future for their support of today's content as well. But obviously, more importantly, as always, thank you, the audience, for your engagement and your interaction and your attendance and giving us your time. Hope you found today's content valuable and you've taken some things away. We'll obviously be closing the event